Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of CEDH Northwest. Today we're going to be talking about CEDH archetypes and what exactly that means for you as a player and how we can evaluate those archetypes, what the general strategies are, the way that color identity plays into archetypes sort of as a influencing factor, and how you can take that information and the sort of heuristics that you can develop regarding color identity and archetypes and improve your own gameplay and assessments of various decks through that. But before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. We have the Quest. It's this event that's coming up. It's just around the corner, actually, in May. So we have the Quest by Tap for Hope. This event is going to be held in Portland, Oregon on the 15th through 17th of May. So that's, like I said, just around the corner from the recording of this episode. It's going to be an awesome event, really large. There's going to be a whole bunch of people there. I think there's already over 150 people registered as of right now. And so it's like a platinum top deck event. It's going to be a 10K, and there's plenty of room for you to register still. So I definitely recommend registering for it. It's also a charity event, so the profits behind the profits from the event are going to fund the Children's Cancer Association. So 15 through 17 in May in Portland, Oregon. Use the QR here, and we'll put the link and everything in the comment section below. So just make sure you register for that if you haven't already. And then we will move back to our main topic at hand. So, archetypes of CEDH. To start this particular conversation, I wanted to begin with a little bit of the philosophy behind color design in Magic and what that kind of looks like in terms of just colors across the board. They're like general identities within this spectrum of their characteristics, right? So what do the typical cards in this pool what traits do they tend to exhibit? Because if we can understand that, then we can sort of figure out how that deviates from what is typical Magic color identity in CEDH. We can figure out what the typical identity of colors are in Magic and how that deviates in CEDH, because there are definitely deviations there. So we're going to start our conversation with a little bit of this color theory. We're just going to go through in Wooburg order. Seems to make the most sense to me. So with that, the life gain, we have white, and that is life gain, damage prevention, artifact destruction, protection of permanents, and also preventing interaction via cards, as well as destroying or exiling creatures. So a lot of the cards that we're going to see are going to be things like Return to Dust. We're going to see lots of destruction effects, whether it's for attacking creatures or blocking creatures. It's like order oriented in terms of characteristics. It's going to gain you life with like Soul Sister effects. It's going to have things like Holy Day or reverse damage to protect you from getting hurt. It's going to prevent certain amounts of damage to your creatures. It's going to have things like Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Solitude, as well as like Wrath of God, right? So we're destroying things, we're exiling things, we're protecting our stuff, and then we're stopping interaction, whether that's a silence or like a God's Willing to grant protection from a color, or something like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, is turning off spell-based stuff, very order-oriented, right? That's like the theory behind it. We have blue. This color it's about control. It's about manipulation. It's about spells, right? We're trying to draw cards so we can cast more spells. We're trying to interact with the stack using our counter magic to establish some variety of control. We're using mind control effects to gain control of creatures. We're temporarily removing any variety of permanent. Older bounce spells in blue would remove even lands. Things like Boomerang or Eyes of Nowhere, just to tempo out your opponent to gain a better... You slow them down, develop your resources slowly, but you're removing their resources along the way. But you also have things like in the Floodmaw, Chain of Vapor to remove creatures and other non-land permanents, right? but it's temporary. There are very few of any destruction spells in blue, right? Then we have expensive and difficult to answer threats. This would be things that range from, at the far origins of Magic, Mahamati Jin, and that's just a 4/6 flyer, right? But at the time, it's difficult to answer, but it's 6 mana, so it's pretty expensive. Coming up to newer threats, things like Aetherling, right? Where it's a 4/5 and it protects itself, it makes its butt bigger, it makes its attack bigger, it can make itself unblockable. It's just very difficult to answer. And then we have black, which uses life as a resource. Think Naws, Necro, Sign in Blood, Night's Whisper, Dreed. They can draw cards, but they're converting their life to do so. Reanimation, whether that's returning a creature card from graveyard to hand or graveyard to play. Zombies, like Gravecrawler, brings itself back. A lot of black creatures will have triggers that bring themselves, or abilities that bring themselves from graveyard to field, tapped or something. And then creature destruction, things like Murderous Cut, Murder, Doomblade, they all just blow up creatures, sometimes with a condition, sometimes not. And then, of course, Hand Hate, Thoughtseize, Duress, Shrieking Affliction gives you a benefit. Liliana of the Veil has opponents discard cards, or sacrifice creatures, which is still creature destruction. And so it's going to be attacking your opponent's resources, bringing your resources back, and then spending your life in order to accomplish some effect. Red is going to be aggressively costed creatures. Think like Monastery Swiftspear, Goblin Guide. These guys have haste. They're 1 mana. They attack immediately. They're on or just slightly above rate. And so they're going to aggressively attack your opponent's life total. Lightning Bolt, you're dealing damage directly from your spells. And then Impulse Draw, especially recently. This has been more of a characteristic of Red in terms of drawing cards, because you expend resources very quickly. You can see several cards, but they go into exile, and then you lose them permanently if you don't cast them or play them, right? And then high risk, high reward cards. I think the primary example of this, and it's really, really good, is just Wheel of Fortune. 7 new cards for you, but also 7 new cards for your opponent. And if your 7 cards are better than their 7 cards, awesome. But if they're not, then you're probably losing the game, right? So just trying to high roll, right? High risk, high reward, you're gambling. There's a card, Dangerous Wager. It's red and 1 that draws you 2 cards at instant speed, but part of the resolution of the effect is discarding your hand, right? So high risk, but potentially high reward. If you have no cards in your hand when you cast the Dangerous Wager, you just drew 2 cards for 2 mana at instant speed, which is something that it's kind of a color pie break, and it's actually just very efficient in general across most colors. Green, obviously, mana ramp. Whether this is from creatures like Llanowar Elves and Birds of Paradise over to something like Land Ramp, being rampant growth, just searches for basics and puts them into play. Exploration is a green enchantment that allows you to play extra lands. Burgeoning puts lands into play when your opponents play lands for turn. So mana ramp to be able to cast big spells. Big, difficult to answer creatures. Things, especially in recent memory, I think of like big creature wise, you got Craterhoof, massive creature, huge threat, resolves killing your opponent, right? But then also even other things that are going to be just more difficult to answer. Carnage Tyrant, uncounterable, 6/6, trample, dinosaur, right? Just going to bonk your opponents. Or it could be something, especially as we're skewing more towards the newer card pool, something like an Allosaurus Shepherd, or a Sanctum Weaver to make your creatures uncounterable, specifically your creatures, in order to make sure they resolve past control magic, right? Creature buffs, we see some auras that bump your creatures. Things like Giant Growth or Titanic Growth spring to mind immediately as just temporary buffs that pump your guy in order to combat trick and send extra damage through. And then, of course, card recursion. Regrowth, obviously, the original card recursion spell, but also like Noctua Survival, Reclaim, Eternal Witness. These cards are all iconic card recursion spells that are green. And then colorless isn't really, it's obviously not a color, but it doesn't have like a massively differentiated identity. but it does focus specifically on artifacts and lands and the effects of those cards, and then just card pool balancing in general. Things like talismans and signets are colorless, but they provide mana of various colors to fix, to ramp, that all sorts of different color combinations can play in order to smooth things out. You could think something like Chromatic Lantern. It would matter in commander decks at lower budgets, sure. Or even just if you're thinking like standard, it's a 3-mana rock that ramps you 1 and also fixes all of your lands. So it's kind of nice if you're like drafting or doing construction or something like that. Okay, so that is the crash course in color theory. Now let's move forward here, talking about archetypes, and then we're going to bring all this together here. So take everything that you just saw a second ago, and we're going to put that to the side. Now we're going to talk about magic archetypes, just briefly what the previous archetypes from 60 card Magic look like. The long and the short of it is of this model on the left here is the triangle of aggro, combo, and control. And in this, you can see the bullet point that aggro has a good matchup on control, which has a good matchup on combo, and then it goes around, combo has a good matchup on aggro. And then the reason for this is that designated in that left model, the aggro deck pumps out damage early and a lot of threats that the control deck might have a hard time answering. The control deck is able to answer the combo pieces from the combo player with their counterspell or their removal. And so because of that, they can sort of tempo them out. And then combo has a good matchup against aggro because the decks are inherently unfair. So while aggro is trying to go 1-for-1 and just jam in 20 damage on your life total, combo is content to take that, go down to 1 life, stabilize, and immediately just whabam. 1-2 punch the aggro deck with some sort of infinite combo or synergy that is so powerful it's unbeatable in a 1v1 20 life format, right? Think like Thragtusk and Restoration Angel. You have 8 power on the battlefield, some of it's evasive. Then when you flickered the Thragtusk, you also gain an extra 5 life and made an extra 3/3 body. So now you have 11 power on the field, 1 of it evasive, you're up 5 life. If they attack you and you block, then you go up another body if your Thragtusk dies. It's just kind of insane, right? So like combos like that. It's just unfair against the fair aggro matchup. The aggro deck has a great early game, like you said, but the control matchup has a good late game. So if control can somehow weather the early onslaught from aggro, then they're typically in a better slot because aggro expended a lot of its resources. Think red, green, aggro stuff. Control is more blue, white, their removal, their order, their counter magic. So we're sort of like building in the color theory idea here, and then combo is going to be things like black or blue, or maybe splashing some red and some white for various different combo pieces here, whatever sort of like fits together. It's just trying to play on the most like out of nowhere axis that you can, which is why we call it unfair, is because you don't see it coming necessarily. Okay. And then the second model on the right here expands upon that idea a little bit more and builds out, introducing some of the sort of like sub-archetypes as people blend strategies and whatnot. So you can see like aggro control or control aggro and the nicknames that those have, whether it's tempo or mid-range, combo and control being spliced together upon an axis where either you are trying to control the early game and combo late, or your primary game plan is to combo, but then you splash in some counter spells to defend yourself or interact with your opponent. Then there's combo aggro, which is going to, you have your combo, but you're just trying to beat them up because your combo pieces are attackers also, or the flip of that, right? So, and you can see once again the axis of like early game, late game, linear, non-linear, fair, unfair, and sort of you can imagine how those are sort of like starting to build together to establish the archetypal metagame of 60 card, right? So with that, CEDH archetypes, it's worth noting, manifest things differently than the aggro combo control triangle. We typically refer to it as like a turbo mid-range and control, or turbo mid-range and stacks, or some variety of those terminologies, right? And so because of that, we can see that there's less aggro because deleting your opponents via exactly 120 damage isn't quite so feasible when you have 3 opponents who are all interacting and gaining or losing life and whatnot. It's just less feasible overall. And so because of that, we tend to identify our archetypes more based upon the speed at which they win and the sort of like game states that they aim to play into, right? So in that vein, we have archetypes in CEDH. And like I said, turbo, mid-range, control are the ones that you'll typically hear listed the most these days. And this model here that I developed is sort of like ranging on a spectrum where there's aggressive and defensive slants for all of these archetypes. And so things will fall into different ranges on this bracket, right? So if we think something like Rogsai, which just balls to the walls, no counter magic, like we're just trying to jam win after win, doesn't really matter what you have, sort of like aggressive turbo, right? There's no defense. We're just sending it with our Squelcher and our defense grid, our quote unquote interaction and protection, right? Things like that. It's just a very aggressive deck that's trying to end the game as quickly as possible. But then you could also play something that's a little bit more defensive that is also aiming to end the game super, super quickly, but it might play more interaction and it might play counter spells that can be useful for the table or whatnot. So I guess actually what a better example would be for aggressive turbo would be something like Rao. They are consistently trying to kill you on turn 2 every single day of the week. And they don't really contribute a lot to the table, right? There's short of them absolutely getting blown out and happening to draw into like a mental misstep or flusterstorm or something offer you can't refuse, something later where it's relevant because they have actually 0 game plan, then they might be able to help. But across the board, they're never trying to help the table, right? Something that would be more defensive turbo could then in that case be Rogsai that plays Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, Force of Will, all of these things. And because their deck it's capable of camping behind Rhystic Study or Mystic Armor or something like that, they're definitely trying to kill you as quickly as possible. But in lieu of that, or going into a bad mulligan, they might play a little bit slower and a little bit more on the defensive foot, right? If someone else at the table is going to be faster than them and their hand is slower, they might be okay sitting back and sandbagging for a while, trying to camp behind those engines and accrue some resources before pushing really hard. Mid-range is mid-range, right? It's mid of the range. You're not trying to play a super long game like a control deck, but you're also not trying to end the game immediately necessarily, right? You want to typically like establish an engine or 2. You're going to push a turn or 2 later than your typical turbo decks. But once again, and this is across the spectrum, you're going to see things that slant aggressive or defensive, right? So something like a Stella Lee deck might play into more of that aggressive mid-range space where they're trying to more proactively kill you, but they're a little slower than like a Rogsai deck because their commander comes out and has to sit for a turn before it can do much, right? So that's would be like aggressive mid-range versus like defensive mid-range might be something like TNT, where you are trying to kill the tables in like that turn 4 to 6 range or whatever, but you're playing a little more defensively. Your mulligans are going to account for other people trying to jam wins early, finding a counter spell, finding an engine to profit off of it, something along those lines, and then trying to get equity from those plays and see more turns in order to capitalize on the efficiency and strength of your deck in a longer game. And then control, of course, same thing. The important thing to note here across all 3 of these archetypes and with the aggressive and defensive slants are that the aggressive and defensive slants for lists give me the exact same 99 cards every single time, same commander, everything. Your deck, this is a spectrum, right? And so your deck might occupy one space, like classically, like you identify it as an aggressive this or a defensive that, but that spectrum can change based upon your pod composition and like what your mulligan is, the way that the board state's starting to play out, things along those lines. Because it's so flexible, we can categorize strategies and general like wants of decks to see certain numbers of turns and whatnot, but there's nothing definitive in CEDH in terms of archetypes. or classifications, because that aggressive and defensive slant can sort of like shift based upon all of those characteristics, right? And I think that's just something that's really important to note there. And so with that, the aggressive and defensive slants, because of the pod compositions and characteristics, they'll frequently take on more of the characteristics of their pilots more than the actual 99 card composition. It's very possible to play a super aggressive turbo deck like Rao defensively, right? Not that you necessarily should or would, but if a defensive pilot picks up a Rao deck, they might just inherently push slower than a turbo player, an aggressive pilot who picks up the same deck, right? I know for like thinking of myself, I'm playing a deck like Atali or something like that. I have to consciously make the decision to sort of jam earlier and like push wins and force check and things like that, because my just native state is to sort of play more defensively. And because of that like preconception in my own way of play, I might wait an extra turn or two to play an Atali to guarantee that I'm gonna get my guy to resolve or something, but waiting that extra time might actually behoove the deck, right? So that's just something to note as well, is that player preference and player style might account for this defensive or turbo slants more than the actual construction of the list, right? Okay, so now if we move forward and we start to talk about the actual archetypes in CEDH and what those mean, what those game plans are, these are some of the key components that I have identified and that I pulled from some other materials. You'll see here I cited a Lamora's Cards video. The video linked here is a really good idea of like what they perceive archetypes in CEDH to be. I don't agree fully, but I think some of the classifications they had are definitely hold true and are worth noting, right? So even within people who are very entrenched in the format, perceptions on what archetypes are can differ, right? And so that's just important to keep in mind, is that you might see something as an archetype and another player might not. So it's once again just still sort of subjective, and that is kind of the difficulty of having a format that's singleton, that is for players, that things they aren't very definitive a lot of the times. But to break these down, we're gonna start with turbo and then just work our way across from there, talking about sort of like what these different components entail. So Nas Necro, obviously it entails Ad Nauseam and Necropotence, Necrodominance. These decks are gonna be focused on like these decks are going to be focused on utilizing their life total, on playing very quickly. They're going to play all our rituals and just try and resolve the Nas or the Necro to see a ton of cards and force a win, right? That's why it's in the turbo bracket. Similarly, commander combo decks tend to fall more in that turbo slot, right? Something like Godo, Stellali, where even like Itali, right? Is your combo is to get to 7 mana and then resolve your commander, more or less, right? And then hopefully you can kill from there. If not, then you're trying to resolve some value engines to grind for a rebuy. Commander combo might tend towards the slower side of turbo, but in general, if the commander 1-2 punches with something, it's generally going to be pretty focused on executing that combo and then as the primary game plan, and then profiting from that, right? So I think the only example that springs to mind for me of a deck that has a commander-specific combo that is not going to actively pursue it as a turbo strategy would be maybe like Tibet. Tibet combos with Time Sieve, but while they might push that quickly sometimes, it's not really going to fall into like and that's because it falls into this another archetype that we're going to talk about later, which is Esper. But that's not really their primary game plan. However, things, like I said, in Izzet, in mono red, mono green, if we think about like Nissa, Resurgent Animist, that deck entirely centers on its commander, tries to play very quickly by resolving 2 land drops, using the Lotus Cobra effect to make a bunch of mana, and then quickly resolve some creature or lands combo to kill you, right? Commander combos tend to be very fast. Doomsday is an archetype that I would be remiss if I didn't mention, mostly because of its historic importance to the format. It doesn't typically show up that much anymore. There are some lists that may play Doomsday for whatever their variant is, whether that is Dimir, or I know that Glarb is a Doomsday deck that people talk about. Yuriko is a Doomsday deck that has existed in the past. These things exist, but mostly for its historic context, when Doomsday was a very powerful card that you could resolve for 3 mana and then try to resolve some sort of infinite afterwards, assuming you could crack the pile, whether that was from a Timna or a Zur or something like that, right? There were important things that you could do with Doomsday. Unfortunately, as the format has evolved, this card has moved towards obsolescence, with the fact that it is triple pipped, a sorcery, costs half your life, exiles all of your other options, and because it does say search your library, loses to opposition agent, loses to Aven Mind Sensor, things like that, right? So card is less prevalent today than it has been in years past, most certainly, but there are still decks that play it to effect, right? Just good to be aware of. And then, of course, Storm is the other one. This frequently layers with Naz and Necro in terms of archetypes. They'll be spliced together. It would be something like Rogsai might fall into this. Rao definitely falls into this, even though that deck does not play Naz or Necro, where the whole idea is just to start chaining spells that make mana together. Italia is also sort of a Storm deck. Stella Lee is like sort of a Storm deck just because you're casting all the spells, right? The important thing to note for Storm is that because they're casting so many spells, a lot of times the actual impact of the spell is not that important. It frequently just draws more cards or makes more mana in order to cancel more spell, in order to see more card or make more mana, right? I think a good example of a deck that probably will come to exist in the competitive space in some manner is the new Prismari. Not Galazeth Prismari, which is the 4 mana Is It Urza card that can only cast instances and sorceries, but I forget what it's called exactly, but the new 7 mana Prismari from Secrets of Strixhaven grants all your spells Storm, which I think builds perfectly into this whole idea of archetype, right? Things like Stormkiln Artist, Rao, Ruby Medallion, these effects are all really, really strong in there because they're reducing costs, make it easier to chain spells together. Birgi is a prime example of a Storm card because you cast a spell and make a mana, and that mana sits around. And then the Birgi itself also has the option to be modal. You can deploy the spell to either make more mana, or you can deploy the backside of the spell to see more card, which combos with wheels to see twice as many cards, to cast more spells, to make more mana, to see more cards, to yada yada yada. You see the idea. So that's the Turbo Suite as far as CEDH as the most prominent archetypes across the board. Midrange incorporates 3 main components and then deviations and combinations thereof. And those are big mana, lands, and Esper. Big mana is typically going to be something like Kinnan, Rog Thras. You're just trying to generate a ton of mana to sink into something, whether that's your commander, which is like a Thrasios or a Kinnan, or some sort of spell, or you're trying to generate a ton of mana to resolve something from hand. These types of cards, I think Semi-Blue would be a good example of that, where you're just making a lot of mana to resolve into big spells that have a very powerful effect. These decks are just literally just trying to make mana, and then they find a way to spend it. Lands decks, this would also sort of be like Rog Thras, could be like Lumra, Gitrog. Of course, those 2 decks that I just listed are faster. They definitely fall on the aggressive side of mid-range if we're thinking about our sliding model there, just because they are lands, they're very good at playing slow, long games. They just play more lands, and that's their whole game plan. But then, and that makes them more mana, which allows them to cast bigger spells and play more lands, right? But the idea is that they also have the option to slam things very, very quickly. If we think Lumra, that's commander combo also, right? So we've sort of fallen that aggressive, defensive, mid-range to turbo area right there, and you slide back and forth. Esper is going to be Literally that, Esper. It comprises the general engines that one thinks of when they say CEDH card advantage or CEDH engines, right? Rhystic Study, that would fall into the Esper archetype. Taru, Smothering Type, Lotho, Mystic Remora, things, Esper Sentinel, things along these lines. Timna fits into an Esper pile, right? The idea behind Esper is that it generates advantage over time frequently because of your opponent's game actions. And because of that, you have a large quantity of resources available to you in the mid to late turns, right? Think like turns 3 to 5 with a Rhystic Study that you resolved on turn 2. Probably got an extra 3 to 7 cards in your hand that you can try and do stuff with, right? Esper itself is a little bit slower color combination because you don't have access to green to ramp or red to ritual, but you do have other ways, a couple of rituals, Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, things like that. You have reanimation to cheat on costs for creatures if you're trying to go that route, but mostly it's just drawing cards and making mana, and then you're using your interaction that you have by virtue of being in blue and white. Think our color theory earlier, right? White is disrupting players' interaction and their ability to cast spells. Blue is removing player spells from stacks or temporarily bouncing something of theirs to their hand. Floodmaw, Silence, Orm's Chant, all of those things, right? Stopping other players, preventing them from interacting with you, like a Grand Abolisher or whatever. Then you play your win attempt on your turn. That's Esper. So mid-range, it's a very broad category, but it's pretty simple across the board. Control, this was a little bit more interesting. I think the nuances for control exist a lot more than mid-range. It's a lot more similar to Turbo in that regard. Stacks doesn't really exist so much anymore, at least specifically in tournament play, because stacks lists can't win games very effectively in 80 minutes right now for a variety of reasons we won't go into today. The general idea of stacks, though, is that you are controlling your opponents based upon the permanents that you're deploying. You have permanent-based interaction that sits on the battlefield, and that disrupts your opponent's ability to play the game effectively at the speed at which they would like to play the game, right? So something like a Grafdigger's Cage stops Evos, stops Reanimates, stops Breach. Something like a Damping Sphere turns off Gaia's Cradle. You have things that could otherwise be effective against your opponent's strategies, like a Thalia Guardian of Thraben, where their non-creature spells cost 1 more, so Storm decks get hurt a lot, or like a Rule of Loss, that actually nobody can play anything other than 1 spell per turn. There's also Tempo, which I would fold into the control shell in CEDH, which is funny because it sits a little bit closer to aggro in 60 card. But the idea in CEDH is that you stick something that is going to generate you consistent value as well as threaten your opponents, right? So I think Yuriko is the perfect example of Tempo in control. You stick Yuriko, which is your early threat, you play it down, it draws you a card per turn, it deals damage to your opponents off that 1 card drawn, and you try and burn them out via the aggro plan, right? Tempo, yeah, at its finest, right? Actually just a perfect example. Thinking a good parallel is Delver, where you stick your little guy early, your little guy burns your opponents by attacking, and then you're just protecting your Delver / your Yuriko, and then the Delver doesn't draw a card itself, you are in the exact same boat of play guy, attack with guy, hit opponent, counter their spell, counter their remove spell, hit untap, hit guy again, do it again, right? And then the toolbox plan, which I think is a little bit more in line with what one would consider classic control. I think traditionally Toolbox sits a little bit more towards mid-range and 60 card archetypes in terms of like what it tries to accomplish. You're trying to play in 60 card, you're trying to play a mid-range game plan where the toolbox itself allows you to think Birthing Pod when it was legal, but it allows you to hunt down and find specific answers to whatever the board state is, or specific threats to whatever the situation you are in allows, right? In CEDH, because we are so tutor heavy and like everything is legal in this format, the options you have are actually a lot broader in terms of toolboxing, which is why it fits really well into the control strategies, because control decks in this format tend to slant one of two ways, which is either more aggressive, more mid-range, right? And you're just slamming down draw engines and trying to just like drown your opponents in resources, and then you're hoping that by virtue of having more card draw, more mana than them, you can answer what they put out. Or you can lean more into toolbox, which is not necessarily trying to generate. You're obviously trying to generate resources, right? Every deck is, but it's not focused so much on trying to drown your opponents in resources as have enough resources that you can always get to whatever the perfect answer is at the time. It's the idea of having the perfect out for whatever the situation is. I would say that this falls more in line with what the decks that I typically try to play go into, right? My deck is a control deck, and I play cards like Aven Interrupter because it can counter Caverned Grand Demolishers, Caverned Voices of Victory, as well as also resolve opposition agents into tutor-heavy decks, or like a Niv Mizzet Parun to deal with board-committed decks or storm decks, right? So those things are more toolboxy answers. They're very flexible, but very specific in what they answer, and they are very good at doing that. And then the deck just plays a lot of ways to get to those things very quickly and very efficiently. And then this note at the bottom here, as I've been listing off these archetypes, I'm sure you've been piecing together in your own head that, oh, my deck does that. Oh, my deck also does this other thing from another archetype. Very true. Because it is a 4-player game and it is a singleton format, we are not trying to optimize our decks into very specific game plans that center on resolving a single card every time in most cases, right? There are obviously exceptions, or like cards that are crazy powerful, like Gaia's Cradle. Like big mana decks, lands decks always want to see a Gaia's Cradle because the card's insane. Esper decks always want to see Heuristic Study because the card's insane. Nas Necro, focus on that specific card, right? But there are also similar cards that achieve similar effects, and decks also have backup plans. For example, because you are playing Nas and Necro does not mean you are not playing the Esper Ristic package, right? Because you are playing a Storm deck does not mean you are not also playing a Commander combo. Because you are playing lands does not mean you are not also playing a Commander combo. Because you're playing a Tempo Shell does not mean you don't also have a Doomsday package built into your deck, right? Or some stacks pieces that affect lists that are not you, right? Things like that all spliced together, but the general theme of what you're trying to accomplish, the ideal board state that your deck angles to play into, the game state that your deck specifically angles to create, that's how at least I identify archetypes around decks. So that's why, for example, Yuriko is always trying to resolve Yuriko. It's always trying to burn you out, except when it happens to randomly Thassa's Oracle you. So yeah, sure, it's playing combo because of Thassa's Oracle. Maybe even it's playing Doomsday, and because of that, it has a very fast turbo-y option. But that's not really what it's trying to do. It's just like sometimes you high roll and the option is there, so you go for it, right? Stacks decks may have a 2-card combo, but they're not trying to use their ritual to resolve their combo pieces and kill you on turn 3 most of the time. But sometimes the hand opens up and they see a window and they go for it, right? But a lot of times they'll use like their one ritual to get their rule out faster, or to tutor and then get their Grafdigger's Cage down the same turn or something like that, so that they can slow the other decks down so that they can play their primary game plan. So archetypes focus on a primary game plan. All right, now how do we apply what we have learned about archetypes to CEDH? Why do they matter? How do we use that knowledge? How do we improve our own win rates and gameplay via this knowledge that we now have? Heuristics are a massive part of CEDH. This is something that I've been talking about a lot recently. Not for any specific reason, it's just been coming up in conversation. But cognitive load in this game, especially at high levels, is massive. You are tracking counterspells that you have used, counterspells that your opponents have used, resources available to them mana-wise, in graveyard, cards drawn, cards that they have the potential to draw, win the game lines of play that either you or your opponents have. You have 3 opponents. You have to triple that. You can't just play for one person's archetype. You have to imagine what each of these commanders and the 99 cards that they have are capable of playing and are going to try and execute. And there are a lot of different permutations within that. There's also politicking, right? Like you can get into these like extensive negotiations on, I will do this if you do that, and then therefore we can out ourselves to this position. Means that we don't die to that player, right? So much going on, and a lot of it happens very quickly, or things escalate very quickly. And it's important to note that this cognitive load can make it very easy to miss stuff, right? I miss things all the time. I play with players who have played with me a bunch, but just don't see a combo line they've died to before happening because there's so much going on. They lost track of a tutor or where a card ended up in my hand or my graveyard 2 turns ago, right? Someone does a face-up tutor like Enlightened Tutor or Worldly Tutor, you know what it is. You know they found Breach. But in the course of them passing the turn, this player attempting to win, the next player drawing 20 cards, a 15-minute stack battle, you taking your turn and trying to win, and now passing back to that opponent, everyone forgot that they also resolved a voice last turn. They just couldn't cast the Breach. So now we pass with no removal spells. The player untaps, plays Underworld Breach under voice protection, and now you just explode. And you knew it was going to happen, but nobody played around it because they just forgot because there was too much going on. The cognitive load was too high. That's one of the reasons that like trigger tokens are really helpful, especially when constructing a stack, is because there's no reasonable way that a player can interact on a stack for 10 to 15 minutes and remember every single trigger that they're trying to respond to, in the case they're trying to respond to triggers and trap things and whatnot. When you have to at some point resolve that stack, something will get missed if you do not use some sort of indicator, because the cognitive load is just too heavy. And you want to try and make sure you avoid missing those things, because then that compromises the game state, right? So heuristics are really important. And what I mean by that, so for those of you who don't know what heuristics are, it's just a mental shortcut. Basically, you establish some cheat code or general rule, and you just shelve it for later in your brain, right? So for example, if I see a Kitten deck, my heuristic is that deck is going to try and win the game with Basalt Monolith. Now, there is no rule that says Kinnan must play Basalt Monolith as its win condition, right? But I think most players who have played Kinnan or against Kinnan will note that a lot of times the games resolve down to, here's a Basalt, I'm going to try and kill you. And so because of that, my heuristic is Kinnan plus 3 mana can probably equal a win. Infinite colorless mana, and they convert it from hand somehow. Whether that's play land for turn and Treasure Vault, whether that is they have 1 green source and now they can green Sunseed for Thrasios to kill us. Like, there are a lot of things, right? But the heuristic that I have for that Assault Monolith is don't let it resolve, because I probably die to infinite mana, right? Infinite mana generally means you lose the game in CEDH. There's not really such a thing as infinite mana, cast my 1 to 2 spells, pass. Not that it can't happen. It's just I wouldn't count on it happening is my point. Right? And so developing these heuristics are really important. One way to start to develop these heuristics is through assessing archetypes and then generalizing your knowledge of what win cons and interactions those different decks play and the various speeds that them and their commanders tend to exhibit, right? So for example, another heuristic that I use myself would be, oh, if there's a Ral at the table, that deck is going to try and kill me on turn 1 to 2. If there's an Atali at the table, that deck is going to try to kill me turn 1 to 2. So I have to mulligan accordingly to make sure that I don't explode, especially being as I'm playing a control deck, kind of my job to make sure that I either remove the Ral or counter the Dino or whatever it happens to be in terms of interacting with them. So when we're extrapolating that, we can say that the knowledge we have of these decks is that they're very fast, their win cons center on their commander, and they play limited interaction, right? So because of that, we can go ahead and say that we don't want to let them have any resources. My heuristic is now mulligan to something that counters Ral or Atali or removes it, pre-acts it in some way, right? And I think this is really, really important as we think about the fast to slow model listed on the right here that we've talked about before. The slower decks a lot of times have to worry about their heuristics to keep themselves alive versus the faster decks might establish heuristics like Italy might have not that you can't mulligan to a hand that has some sort of like grind engine via a library or a one ring or something like that. But your heuristic is going to be, does the hand make 7 mana on turn 1 or 2? Great, we'll keep it because it casts the dinosaur. Not always going to be the case, right? There are times where you want to circumvent your heuristics in order to make better game decisions based upon the situation. You have to be really careful at playing against really skilled players because sometimes they will take your established heuristics and try to fold them against you, right? So this is a really good example of a game I had the other day, actually. My deck plays Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster Mage combos with Twin Flame effects. I was playing against an Italy player, and the Italy player puts not Finale of Promise. Anyways, it's some red and XX spell that makes X copies that have haste till end turn, target a creature. It's just Twin Flame. Now, did I have a way in hand to recycle my Dualcaster Mage that was on the battlefield and kill them in response? No. But what I did say was, hey, what does that card say? Can I read it? I pick up the card and read it. My opponents have already described what the card does. I'm looking at terminology on the card. My opponents are now they're not incompetent. They are very skilled, and because of this, they see the Dualcaster Mage and note that the deck that I play has various flicker effects and whatnot, and they decide to not cast the spell instead because they are scared that the Dualcaster Mage recycle will result in them losing the game. Very heads up play, but they don't know that I don't have a way to recycle it, right? But they're playing around that because of their heuristic that Dualcaster Mage and this card results in a kill. And so that's just something that you can do on the flip side of weaponizing your opponent's heuristics against them. Another thing would be like playing as a slower deck, you keep a really aggressive hand. We've talked about playing outside of our established like timelines and play patterns. You could keep a really aggressive hand as a slower, like mid-range or control deck. But if your opponents know what your deck does, and they know that in theory you should be mulliganing for some variety of interaction to stop them, a faster deck, they might play a little slower or play a little more scared in order to sort of have more resiliency to push through an interaction piece. But you don't actually have anything. You're just trying to jam a win as fast as possible on your turn, right? And so you can sort of weaponize those against people. Choosing your role. So there's this really famous article from years back called Who's the Beatdown? Highly recommend it. I have not actually cited it here, so I apologize for that. But this article more or less talks about identifying what your role in the game is in 1v1 Magic. Is the aggro deck trying to beat someone up and kill them as quickly as possible? Or is the aggro deck actually supposed to sit back and like play a more tempo/control oriented game because of the matchup they're playing into? And really great article. It's fundamental for Magic the Gathering theory. Highly recommend reading it. But the long and the short of it is, CEDH doesn't quite function the same way. There's no beatdown per se, where one person is actively trying to aggro the opponent. The equivalent of that would, of course, be a turbo deck or some deck trying to win very quickly. But because it's a 4-player format, things are a little bit different, and the archetypes don't quite line up the same way. The long and the short of this is that you want to be able to identify when you sit down at the table what your role is, whether that's you are supposed to mulligan for a counterspell or an engine or an aggressive game plan. And based upon how you mulligan, how are your opponents going to mulligan? Do your opponents know what their role is? Are they going to play their role correctly? Do you have to have a pregame conversation to make sure they know what their role is, right? Sometimes it's very, very beneficial for you to sit down and go, hey guys, just so everyone knows, that deck over there is going to try and kill us on turn 2. I'm going to be trying to find interaction of some variety. I highly recommend you all do the same because I don't know if I'll find it, don't know if I can beat them by myself. So I would recommend that you also mulligan for something. Hey guys, that Magda deck is really efficient. Once their commander resolves, it's really hard to stop them. I recommend that we all find either Opposition Agent or Orcish Spellmasters or some variety of removal spell, because we're going to need that versus a Magda player. Those types of things, right? Or sometimes you sit down and you go, I'm the Rao player, I'm the Atoli player. My job is to try and win the game as fast as possible. It is their job to answer me because my deck is just faster than these 3 Esper decks, right? If they all mulligan for turn 2 Rhystic Study and I have turn 1, turn 2 Atoli, I'm probably going to beat them anyways, right? If they're all tapped out for turn 2 Rhystic and I'm putting the turn 2 Dino on the stack, I'm probably fine in winning the game. And so identifying your role is critical. You also want to make sure that your approach to the game matches your personal play style. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the aggressive or defensive slants frequently being more keyed to a player's style preference rather than their actual deck list, because a lot of decks will fall pretty solidly in the middle of one of those or those two areas, whether it's turbo and mid-range or mid-range and control. They'll fall somewhere in that spectrum in between the two, and based upon your hand or your personal preference, you're going to try and slant your gameplay one way or another, right? Maybe you're going to play a little more aggressively, maybe you're going to play a little more defensively. Frequently you will see more success when you try and match your play style, whether you're an aggressive player or a defensive player, to whatever your archetype is in general, right? So if you're playing a more aggressive version of TNT, lower counter magic, fewer silences, less removal, it's probably really good if you are more inclined to just kind of force check people and jam, as opposed to if you're a more cautious player, playing that style of list might provide you with less positive results than playing a more defensive style that only plays 1 to 2 win conditions, but plays a ton of interaction to make sure that when you do decide, your opponent's resources are drained, and when you do decide to go for it, it's resolving, right? And you're winning the game. The last note for these archetypes is they have various political advantages if you know what the archetypes of your opponent's decks are based upon just your commanders, right? You can have pre-game conversations, like I said, about choke points, about likely play patterns, about the common sequences that your opponents are going to execute, right? When your Rogfast opponent goes and says, cast Spellseeker, it's important to note that sometimes, like if there's like a strict serenade, right? Like we can counter a creature spell. Well, this is getting a crop rotation to cast that and go get Gaia's Cradle. So we can either choke them on the Cradle by strixing the Spellseeker now, or we have to find a way to counter the crop rotation, right? It's a weird example because Strix doesn't see a ton of play, but that example holds true, right? Sometimes less quote-unquote optimal interaction points are the only interaction point based upon the decks at the table and the play patterns that they're going to try to execute. And the more familiar you are with those play patterns your opponents are going to try and make, the easier it is for you to talk through those sequences with your opponents, right? Choking a Kinnan deck on mana early, but leaving them with cards might mean that they're able to counter win attempts from other players, but not massively advance their own board state. Similarly, leaving a Rogsai player with a ton of mana but no cards in hand might mean that the deck is just going to sit there and not really do anything for the rest of the game. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? Turbo, there's a note here that Turbo struggles more in long and high resource games. Control struggles more in the early game because they have to establish engines, so that their resources are more limited to answer different threats, right? So being familiar with what style of deck your opponents are playing based upon their commanders, their color identities when they sit down, leaves you a lot more play in terms of how you want to mulligan, the conversations you want to have in order to influence the course of the game in your favor. And then this last little bit, circling all the way back to the beginning here, applying MTG color theory to the CEDH archetypes, right? So at the beginning of the episode here, we are talking about like how white does life gain and artifact destruction, blue does card draw. All of this holds true in CEDH to some extent. The main thing here is that there are some very, very characteristic cards of CEDH that might break color pie, color theory, comparatively to 60 card Magic or more traditional Magic. And in this, we see like white is definitely interacting with your opponent's abilities to cast spells via silences and whatnot. They're going to be playing some amount of exile or destruction removal. Swords to Plowshares is a staple in the format. There might be some white cards like Lauren of the third path that's in play that blow up artifacts or enchantments. But a lot of white is actually going to be focused on Smothering Tithe, Tar, generating these treasures in order to ramp. They have some amount of card draw too, but a lot of it is going to be like silences and Smothering Tithe. That's where most of white is. And then, of course, removal. Blue is obviously card draw, just like with Divination in 60 card. There's Rhystic and Mystic in Commander. We play Counter Magic to disrupt the stack. Not a ton of tutors, and there really aren't a ton of like difficult to answer but large and expensive threats in blue that come from just blue in CEDH. You're mostly going to get those threats by combining blue with other colors. Black gets Nas Necro, we're spending our life total. They get efficient tutors, which is not a characteristic typically of 60 card. It's something that they do play in certain formats, but really efficient tutors like Demonic Tutor is something that is very characteristic specifically to CEDH black decks. Reanimation, they have some amount of rituals. Red gets characteristically high risk, high reward plays such as wheels, some amount of rituals. They don't really do spell damage so much. That's more of a niche thing. But if you see red, you can probably assume in most cases Underworld Breach. That's a very characteristic application of red in CEDH. Similarly, green shows you Mana Dorks, Cradle, lands combo, evolutions such as Eldritch Evolution or Finale of Devastation, Chord of Calling, things like that can generally, Nature's Rhythm can generally be assumed to be in play if there's green at the table. And then some variety of creature combo or creature being involved in the combo is probably part of a green deck. Excuse me. It's going to be something like Kitten and Basalt combo together are going to get you your infinite mana, right? But there's a creature involved in that combo. It's really important to note here, we're going to move down to some examples, that the combination of colors can be used to very, very effectively extrapolate the general strategy of what any deck in CEDH is going to do. Example, Kinnan is blue and green. Deck plays a ton of draw engines, ton of stack interaction, also plays a lot of dorks because it's green, rocks, we're trying to make big mana. The commander itself literally reads make more mana with an ability to spend a lot of mana. So you can probably assume that the deck is going to make a lot of mana, if not infinite mana, and then try and spend that into its commander, right? Similarly, Dahada is red, which gives you rituals, wheels, Underworld Breach. Black, which is going to give you Ad Nauseam, tutors, once again some rituals, and white, which is going to be silences, and then maybe some removal. You see white, Dahada makes treasures. That makes sense. It's just really like you see red and black together and you go, oh, this is probably some variety of Nas strategy, some variety of life lost to draw a card strategy. And then also Underworld Breach is going to be there, right? If someone is not playing those cards, they'll probably be happy to tell you as part of like the pre-game conversation. A lot of times players are happy to say, I'm not playing this thing based upon my color identity because they believe it removes threat level from them. And I think it's just really important to note that like red black is going to be life loss and ad nauseam, blue green is going to be card draw and ramp. If we splash white, we're almost certainly going to be seeing silences of some variety. So you can make these assessments based upon what colors are in your commander's identity along with the text on the card, right? Dahada also says put cards in graveyard. It says make mana, put cards in graveyard, and is red. white gets you Sabine's Reclamation for some amount of recursion for Breach. If the deck is not playing Underworld Breach, you would be very, very surprised had you never played against a Holler before. It does play Underworld Breach. So that would be very surprising if it wasn't, right? So that's just something to note there. And I think the last point along all of this is that the commanders themselves are a big giveaway a lot of times to what the strategy is. Whether it's because of activated abilities that cost mana but don't require a tap, means that infinite mana gets you somewhere, probably in theory as a general principle. Or this is a weird commander I've never seen before. The effect is unique. The colors are black and blue, but it doesn't draw cards. Then you can probably look at it again and say, okay, does it give you access to cards from somewhere else, which could be quote unquote card draw? No. Okay. Well, the card itself tutors under this condition. Interesting. Even if you can't figure out quite what it is, you can assume several things from that, right? You could say, well, blue, almost certainly playing Mystic, counter magic. Black, most certainly playing some variety of efficient black tutors, probably some rituals. Could be on Nas Necro, right? Life loss. But this has a weird effect on it, right? Like I've never seen this card before that pays 2 and sacks itself to cast an instant or sorcery card from the graveyard. That's interesting. Okay, some sort of spell reanimation going on here, probably on an Entomb. They're going to use their graveyard somewhat. What can they do with that? I don't know, but I do have to be aware of some sort of commander combo. So every sort of like off meta card that goes on the stack now should kind of put you on high alert. And you go, what does that do? And then think about, how does this card, being that it's so unique and I've never seen it played before, how does this interact with their commander and the current board state? Am I about to just explode to something that I have never seen before? Not that all cards that you don't recognize should be countered on rip, but a lot of times just a card that you don't recognize, especially with commander you don't recognize, should put up flags that there's something going on here, because a player's not going to be playing a card in CDH unless they think it's good, or maybe it itself is bad, but it's very, very powerful in this specific situation with this other specific card. So you just have to be aware of those types of things. But that's more or less everything that I have for CEDH archetypes and like how to analyze them. It's, like I said at the beginning, it's a little bit flexible. There aren't a lot of definites in this particular area of the game. You just have to like make sure that you're consciously assessing color identity of commanders, the casting cost of commanders, the effects of commanders in order to gain those advantages, and then being familiar with the various archetypes and color pairings, as we talked about earlier on this slide, to make sure that you have an idea of what's going on and what their primary game plan is. Because if you know what a deck's primary game plan is, it is much easier to cut them off at the knees and stop them from doing anything too powerful that lets them run away with the game, and keeping them in a manageable position where they can help you, or at the very least, they won't be getting in your way. So with all of that, thank you everyone for tuning in again, and I will see you next time. Just make sure to drop a like and then follow and subscribe to the channel. That's really helpful. It helps other people to see the channel. And then of course, comments, love to see those. Let me know what your thoughts are. Are there any archetypes that you think that I missed that are worth mentioning? Do you think that I got anything wrong? Please let me know. I'm always curious to hear what other people have to say. So, thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.